Let's turn our attention in this lecture module to going over some of the concept types that we can find in ontological frameworks. We call ontological frameworks are the structures. They have a set of concepts or categories. They articulate a framework with which we can break up the phenomenon of a domain, understand it, ask questions about it, and so on. To do that, they specify kinds of things, kinds of properties, kinds of relationships, and kinds of changes. So we have fundamental kind categories as an important part of an ontological framework. So for instance, in the readings, I talk about how forces are a fundamental kind in physics. So gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, the strong and weak nuclear forces, all of the field forces are fundamental categories, kinds of forces. Similarly, when we think about elemental chemistry and even the atomic version thereof, it has a whole set of fundamental kinds. So this is the modern periodic table, and it has all of the elements identified to date. And for instance, these blue elements here, those are the noble gases. They are single molecule gases that are relatively non-reactive. They're not the only ones, of course. Hydrogen's over here, the most common molecule in the universe, also a single molecule gas, but it will oxygenate. That is, it will burst into flames, and so it's not over there in the noble gas column. But all of these squares here, they correspond to fundamental elements of elemental chemistry. In the philosophy of mind, we'll see, particularly in this early section of the history of philosophical metaphysical speculation, this merging, this accretion of properties into one fundamental kind, the soul. And we'll see that it draws on properties from things that we do distinguish pre-theoretically. In fact, we're innately disposed to distinguish. So a category distinction between living and non-living, a category distinction between animate and inanimate, and a category distinction between mental and non-mental. Now, as I say, these fundamental kind categories get developed, made more rigorous and systematic as we move from pre-theoretic or pre-scientific or proto-scientific or proto-theoretic treatments of a set of phenomenon. They become more systematic and rigorous, but they initially oftentimes are drawn from our ordinary everyday categorizations for the relevant phenomenon. Not always, not always. So here is an example of the sort of fundamental, ordinary, everyday categories that in fact do get recruited into the early philosophical ruminations about the nature of the soul, the thing for which all of the properties that ultimately will be associated with the mind get accreted to. And as I note in the chapter, we have these fundamental native distinctions that we draw in even low-level perceptual processing of visual scenes. So the research on this actually goes back quite a long way. When we look here, that picture on the right, the saccades that I included in the chapter there, that picture that emphasizes how people really do pick out faces and assign a certain amount of salience to faces in a visual scene. That work was actually originally done. In fact, that particular picture was used by this guy, Yarbus. In 1967, he published this about saccadic parsing of a visual scene, noting that people showed this preferential salience. They assigned those features that were associated with mental creatures, like faces, a preferential salience. This other article is much, much later, 2015, and it comes from this paper called The animicity continuum. And this talks about processing in the ventral visual processing stream. And it is an fMRI study. It's a functional magnetic resonance imaging study of the brain when people are looking at these various objects. And their thesis is that, in fact, there is a significant visual processing difference. That is, there are different parts of the brain already that get devoted to processing inanimate objects versus animate objects. And so they call it an animacy continuum. And as we'll note, it's not a perfect continuum on all dimensions. When you look at this dimension, right, then you see that in fact there's a strong spatial separation, a significant conceptual rift between, on the one hand, animate things, and on the other hand, inanimate things. They chose Hamer and Keyes. But when you turn that dimension around here, what you discover is that, well, it's not clearly as demarcated as you would think it is, right? So lobsters and hammers are pretty closely represented with each other. Ladybugs and keys are over here. Here's another key. So these kinds of animals, these kinds of animate creatures, they are actually not so conceptually distinct along this line of reference, along this spatial analysis. However, when you start looking at cats and people and chimpanzees, then you've got a more significant difference. But there is this differentiation, this continuum, but nevertheless significant break between animate and inanimate objects. And we find the same sort of thing for living versus non-living visual processing and semantic memory. I'll finish out this module by noting why it is that it might be the case that we have these native dispositions to categorize the world in terms of living versus non-living, animate versus inanimate, and mental versus non-mental. It all has to do with evolution and survival. So being able to distinguish between living and non-living creatures is an important means of distinguishing between biological and non-biological matter, and specifically between food and things that you cannot eat or get nutritional benefit from. So that distinction, that ability to recognize that something is alive, whether it is a plant or an animal or an insect, any living creature is at least potentially a source of nourishment. And so you want to be able to distinguish them from chairs or rocks or other non-biological matter. Similarly, animate versus inanimate is an important distinction, the importance of which probably dates back to roughly around 541 million years ago, to the beginning of the Cambrian era. That is, the period often referred to as the Cambrian explosion, in which nearly every phyla in contemporary biology starts to emerge in the fossil record. It is the period of time in which not only does life proliferate, but life becomes ambulatory, distinctions start to emerge between predators and prey, and so on. Why would that be important then? Well, you want to be able to distinguish between things that can move and come and eat you and things that are just flowing in currents or blowing in the breeze and so on. The ability to recognize that something is animate versus just moving. That's an important distinction, whether you're looking for those animate things to be a predator or you're trying to avoid being eaten by a predator. Finally, the mental versus non-mental distinction, again, that corresponds to the sophistication of the sort of thing that you are trying to avoid or get. So if you want to be able to avoid dangerous predators, be able to distinguish the ones that are capable of self-propulsion, then you want to be able to identify creatures with nervous systems, that is, mental creatures. In order to be an effective and efficient ambulatory creature, you must have sensing mechanisms and ideally a sophisticated nervous system that integrates them with motor control and processes them to a high degree of sophistication.